Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed for another Mega GPU Showdown. Feels like it's been a while since we've done one of these. Probably has something to do with Ryzen. Anyway, on the menu for you today we have a grand total of 7 games. Just kidding guys. 27 games, and they were all tested at the 1080p and 1440p resolutions. Obviously we're pitting the new Radeon RX 580 against the new GeForce GTX 1060, this gaming X model from MSI that has that faster 9 gigabits per second memory. And then of course we will also be throwing in the GeForce GTX 1060, the EVGA model, so that's the standard 1060, a little bit confusing, but that's the model we've been using previously. And we've also been using the MSI Gaming X RX 480 for testing previously as well. All the results were recorded in the past week using the latest AMD and Nvidia display drivers. So as I said, 27 games have been tested using 4 graphics cards at 2 resolutions. The results are based on an average of 3 runs, so that means over 600 benchmark runs were made, and this video will be showing over 430 individual results. Last week I proposed a list of 25 games to the Hardware Unboxed Patreon members, and with a little back and forth we ended up at 27 games. Those of you that were keen to see the results for The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt can thank Scooby-Doo for his input there. If you would like to become a Hardware Unboxed patron and support the channel, we would very much appreciate that, so I'll provide a link in the video description. Anyway, back to the matter at hand, our mid-range GPU battle. If you have $230 to $280 to spend on a new graphics card, which should you get? Well, we're about to go and find out. Before we do though, here are a few things to note. The graphics cards used for testing include the EVGA GTX 1060 for the Win Plus, MSI GTX 1060 Gaming X Plus, and from the red team we have the MSI RX 480 Gaming X8G, and the Aorus RX 580 Extreme Edition. The EVGA for the Win Plus is very aggressively overclocked from the factory, featuring a base clock speed of 1362 MHz. Meanwhile, the MSI Gaming X Plus comes clocked at 1569 MHz, potentially making it 4% slower. That said, the MSI model does feature 9 gigabits per second GDDR5 memory, which means out of the box its memory is clocked 12% higher, so it will be interesting to see what, if any, kind of difference this makes. Finally, all testing was conducted using our Kaby Lake Core i7 7700K test machine, overclocked to 4.9 GHz. I'm sure there will be dozens upon dozens of comments asking for a retest using a Ryzen CPU, and yes, at some point down the track we will do exactly that. For now though, let's check out the numbers we have gathered already. Responsible for more dropped frames than ATI's Catalyst drivers, Grand Theft Auto 5 is a game many of you won't let me drop. So starting things off, we have the oldest game tested, and as you can see it appears to favour the green team. Looking at the 1440p results, we see that the GTX 1060 was 17% faster than the RX 480, meanwhile the new RX 580 boosted AMD's performance here by just 4%, which meant they were still 14% slower than the original GTX 1060. Another oldie is The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, and again this is back due to popular demand. Honestly, I'll probably be testing this title till The Witcher 4 comes out in a year or so's time. This is another title where the green team has a slight advantage, and yes, we did test with Hairworks enabled, which does give Nvidia a slight, very slight advantage. It's certainly not a big enough deal to take to the comment section in protest. Never mind, too late, there's already a dozen comments, isn't there? Anywho, as you can see, the RX 580 was 6% faster than the RX 480, which meant it was still 6% slower than the GTX 1060s, both of which delivered the same average of 53 FPS. We can't be too far away from another Tomb Raider game either. Rumour has it the game is being developed while travelling on public transport, a strategy Crytek's likely to adopt for the development of Crysis 4. We know that Rise of the Tomb Raider was developed in conjunction with the green team, but over time AMD has been able to optimise their hardware for this title quite well. As a result, the RX 480 is now just a few frames behind the GTX 1060, while the RX 580 is able to match the new high-speed 9 gigabits per second version. Right now there are currently more people playing Command & Conquer Red Alert 3 on Steam than they are Ashes of the Singularity. A lot more. This is probably why the game has earned the title Ashes of the Benchmark. There could quite possibly be more people benchmarking the game right now than actually playing. Anyway, in my opinion, the game is still one of the best examples of a well put together DX12 title we have, though it is much more useful for testing CPUs than it is GPUs. The RX 580 enjoys a slight performance advantage over the GTX 1060, though for a DX12 title the margins are hardly significant. There are more than twice as many people still playing 2014's Far Cry 4 when compared to the more recent Primal version. Even so, we have stuck with the more modern title for benchmarking. The GTX 1060 was 5% faster than the RX 580, while the 9GB per second version boosted performance by a further 3%, so a slight advantage for Nvidia here. Tom Clancy's The Division was tested using DirectX 12, and Nvidia has made up some ground with this API. That said, the AMD GPUs were still able to snatch the lead, and at 1080p the RX 580 was 8% faster than the enhanced GTX 1060. Moving to 1440p extended that lead, and now the RX 580 can be seen providing 11% more performance. Another title which was tested using DirectX 12 is Hitman, and here things are again very much neck and neck. Again, Nvidia has made great strides recently in this title, and as a result, even with DX12 enabled, the GTX 1060 was able to match the RX 580 while managing to pull ahead of the RX 480. AMD has made up quite a lot of ground in Quantum Break thanks to their own driver development. For testing, we do use the Steam revision of the game, and AMD now look to be providing stronger performance in the DirectX 11 version. Even so, the RX 580 was still 4% slower than the GTX 1060, though all 4 GPUs did push over 60 FPS when testing at 1080p. For testing Overwatch, I used the same 5-minute benchmark used to measure CPU performance, so this is a 12-player bot match. The Epic Quality preset was used and the render scale was manually set to 100%. Here we see at 1080p the higher clocked RX 580 makes up a good bit of ground on the GTX 1060, while the higher clocked 9GB per second version of the GTX 1060 made little difference. And here it is, still the only demanding game to take advantage of the Vulkan API. No doubt much to AMD's dismay. Interestingly, EVGA's For the Win Plus was faster than MSI's Gaming X Plus model, which utilises the higher clocked memory. The margins weren't significant though, the EVGA version was about 4% faster at 1080p. Anyway, what's key to note here is just how much faster the Radeon RX 580 is when compared to the fastest GTX 1060 tested. Here it was 14% faster, and that's the largest performance discrepancy seen so far. Even the RX 480 lays waste to both GTX 1060 models in this title. Total War Warhammer has been tested exclusively using DirectX 12, and this appears to hand a rather large performance advantage to the Radeon GPUs. That said, it is interesting to note that even with the low-level API, the AMD GPUs do dip down to lower frame rates, despite delivering stronger average performance. Honestly, the experience seemed very much the same using any one of the 4 graphics cards tested, though looking at the figures you might assume the GeForce graphics cards provided the smoother experience. The RX 580 was just 3% faster than the RX 480 and Mirror's Edge Catalyst when comparing the average frame rate, while the minimum was exactly the same. This then meant that it was 4% slower than the GTX 1060. The new 9GB per second version of the GTX 1060 also offered nothing new in terms of performance for this title. F1 2016 often provides competitive results, and we see this once again when comparing the RX 580 and GTX 1060. This time the RX 580 was able to deliver 7% more performance than the RX 480 at 1080p, which placed it on par with the GTX 1060. Deus Ex Mankind Divided is an AMD-sponsored title, though is often the case with time, Nvidia has been able to better optimize their drivers for improved performance. The GTX 1060 is roughly on par with the RX 480 now, and again we see that the 9GB per second model has nothing extra to add. As a result, the RX 580 enjoyed a reasonably comfortable win here, leading the GTX 1060 by a 9% margin. If there's one thing that gets nerds riled up more than thermal paste application, it's testing games that support DirectX 12 using DX11. Well aware of the risks, this is exactly what we've done when testing Battlefield 1. The DX12 performance is still a little off in this title. It's a bit strange, and we often see lower minimums with the Radeon graphics cards, so again we are sticking with DX11 for this title. Here we see that the RX 480 and GTX 1060 are pretty well even at both resolutions. The RX 580 though is still able to pull ahead thanks to a 6% performance advantage, hitting 91 FPS on average at 1080p. As they so often are, the Mafia III numbers are interesting. The Radeon GPUs are clearly faster at 1080p, while oddly they struggle to match the GTX 1060 at 1440p. Focusing on the 1080p numbers, we see that the RX 480 is 10% faster than the GTX 1060, while the RX 580 is 15% faster. So a clear win for AMD here then, at least when looking at the 1080p resolution anyway. Gears of War 4 might be a DirectX 12 title, but it was also sponsored by Nvidia, so take this DX12 performance with a grain of salt. Typically, you would expect the Radeon GPUs to perform well in a DX12 title, but here we see the RX 580 trailing the GTX 1060 by a 13% margin. Once again though, we find the upgraded memory doesn't help the GTX 1060 out. Titanfall 2 has always played better on hardware from the Red team, though to be fair, this game isn't terribly demanding and plays well on pretty much anything. That said, at 1080p, the RX 580 was 12% faster than the enhanced GTX 1060. We also saw a 7% increase over the older RX 480 in this title. Civilization 6 is a lot like Ashes of the Singularity in the sense that it mostly tests CPU performance. As you can see, we are mostly CPU limited at 1080p. Once we move to 1440p though, the GPU starts to become the performance limiting component, and here we see the RX 580 is able to deliver 9% more performance than the GTX 1060. AMD did a great job of optimizing their software for Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, and have led Nvidia in this title from day one. Typically, this is a hugely popular series and therefore a big win for AMD. Of course, knowing AMD's luck, it shouldn't be a surprise that this installment of the Call of Duty series tanked. With an all-time peak of just 15,000 players, that's less than half the already underwhelming figure from the previous title. Black Ops 2, for example, peaked at over 70,000 concurrent players. Anyway, Call of Duty shortcomings aside, the RX 580 does very well here, providing 17% more performance than the GTX 1060. That said, the RX 580 was just 5% faster than the RX 480. The Radeon RX 580 was around 13% slower than the GTX 1060 in Dishonored 2. In fact, the RX 580 only just broke the 60 FPS barrier at 1080p, while the GTX 1060 only dipped to 55 FPS. So a clear win for the Nvidia GPUs here then. Watch Dogs 2 is the third AAA title released last November that we test with, and it's certainly one of the most demanding on system resources. The RX 580 was just 8% slower than the GTX 1060 here, and once again it did only offer very mild gains over the RX 480, around 5% more frames. The RX 580 ensures that you'll have the crap scared out of you at the highest possible frame rates of any mid-range graphics card in Resident Evil 7. Here at 1080p, the 580 was good for an average of 107 FPS, though that did make it just 4% faster than the 480. More importantly though, the RX 580 was 15% faster than the GTX 1060, and this allowed for a smoother experience at 1440p. The honourable thing to do here was enable a fair fight, and this is exactly what For Honor does. Performance was very much the same across all 4 GPUs tested, so not much else to say here. Visually, the game was maxed out, so it was nice to see over 60 FPS at all times when playing at 1080p. Released in March 2017, Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Wildlands is a very demanding open world title. That said, at 1080p we saw very respectable frame rates using the very high quality preset. Once again, the RX 580 was just a few frames faster than the RX 480. Here we see a 5% bump for what is essentially a mild factory overclock. The 9 gigabits per second GTX 1060 was even more underwhelming, though the standard GTX 1060 was still able to best the RX 580 in this title. That said, the margins were slim at 1080p, while there was nothing separating them at 1440p. Also released in March, we have Mass Effect Andromeda, and like For Honor, this title provides very competitive results. Performance at 1080p using the ultra quality preset was good, though the game did feel a bit laggy at 1440p on all the graphics cards tested. Finally, the last game tested is also the most recently added to our battery of benchmarks, Warhammer Dawn of War 3. This game was tested with the latest AMD display driver, which advertised a 7% performance boost for the RX 580. The Radeon GPUs were most impressive when looking at the minimum frame rate, as the RX 580 was 13% faster than the GTX 1060. Previously, we saw when configured with the RX 480 that our system consumed around 10% more power than the same system configured with the GTX 1060. Here we see an 11% increase. That figure is increased by a further 10% with the RX 580, which pushed total system consumption to 344 watts. This meant that the total system consumption was 22% higher with the Aorus RX 580 than it was with the EVGA for the Win Plus. With peak consumption still well under 400 watts for a system running a 7700K at 4.9 GHz, the RX 580 is hardly a power-hungry beast. Still, for those seeking maximum efficiency, the GTX 1060 is clearly the better option here. Right then, that's the easy bit taken care of. Time to pick a winner. Actually, maybe I'll just end the video there and let you guys fight it out in the comments. Nah, what the hell, you guys are going to do that anyway, so I might as well give you Steve's 2 cents. First, let's see how they compare when averaging the data across all 27 games tested. Here we see that overall the 9GB/s Gaming X Plus model was no faster than the EVGA for the Win Plus, the very model we've been using for all our GTX 1060 testing. This means overall the RX 480 was just 2.5% slower than the GTX 1060 at 1080p or 2 FPS, so a negligible difference then. The RX 580 boosted performance by just 5%, which made it just 2 FPS faster than the GTX 1060, or again 2.5%. So overall the RX 580 was faster than the GTX 1060, albeit by an insignificant margin. If we remove the DirectX 11 titles and focus solely on those that support low-level APIs, we see that the GTX 1060 and RX 480 are roughly on par with one another. That said, the RX 580 is now 6% faster than GTX 1060. Not a huge margin by any means, but still a clear win for the red team in those more modern titles. Now let's take a closer look at where the big wins and losses were had for each team. Right away, it's interesting to note that AMD took the lead in the majority of the games tested, 15 to Nvidia's 11, while they drew in just a single title. That said, margins were extremely slim in Overwatch, For Honor, and F1 2016. The RX 580 was faster by a 10% margin or greater in Total War Warhammer, Titanfall 2, Mafia 3, Resident Evil 7, Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, and Doom. Meanwhile, it was 10% slower in just 3 titles, being Dishonored 2, Gears of War 4, and Grand Theft Auto 5. So in terms of performance, they are very similar. That said, out of the box, the RX 580 is slightly faster, though of course it uses quite a bit more power as well. If you were to base this comparison on the suggested retail prices, the RX 580 seems like the obvious choice. The MSRP has been set at $230 US for the 8GB model, while the GTX 1060 costs $250 for the base model, and there is no MSRP for the 9GB/s models, but they do tend to be more expensive. Currently, most RX 580 models are priced at $250 US, so we really need to see a price correction here. That said, there is a Power Color Red Dragon model selling for $230, but the Gigabyte Aorus model we checked out currently costs $280, which is a bit rich in my opinion. Meanwhile, the GTX 1060 models also start at around $230, though again most are priced around $250. The EVGA for the Win Plus model that we use for testing also costs $280, while the new 9GB/s model from MSI costs an eye-watering $290 US. So again, you really could go either way. It really comes down to the games you play and the features you want to take advantage of. In this mid-range affordable market segment, AMD's FreeSync, which is now very widely supported, is a huge selling point. AMD has also been making a heap of noise in regards to their Radeon Chill feature, and while it does seem to work quite well, I have to admit this is a feature I would never enable or use on my own personal gaming rig. So AMD probably offers better features at this price point, namely their FreeSync, but it doesn't exactly seal the deal. It's interesting to look back at the RX 480 versus GTX 1060 battle and see how things have evolved. Our day one GeForce GTX 1060 coverage compared these mid-range GPUs in 28 games back in July 2016, and at the time the GTX 1060 dominated, winning at over 85% of the titles tested to beat the RX 480 by a convincing 12% margin. However, just 5 months later we did retest with 19 games, some of which were newly released titles at the time, along with AMD's Crimson Relive drivers. The result did see AMD close the margin significantly, and now the GTX 1060 was just 1% faster than the RX 480. In other words, performance was much the same on either GPU. Then fast forward another 5 months, which brings us to today, we have more new games, new drivers, and even new graphics cards. Well, refreshed graphics cards. As you just saw, the GTX 1060 is still a fraction faster than the RX 480, but the new overclocked 580 model has enough in the tank to get one up on the GeForce graphics card. For me, efficiency really is important, and this is why I've been a huge fan of Nvidia's Pascal architecture. That said, this latest comparison, I have found myself drawn more towards the RX 580, and I think this is the card I would be picking up if I was in the market for a sub $300 US mid-range graphics card. The fact that it was faster in the majority of games tested and the widespread availability of really good FreeSync monitors has pushed me in favour of the red team. Of course, there really is no wrong choice here, and I could have easily justified picking up the GTX 1060 instead. Needless to say though, the competition is extremely fierce in the sub $300 GPU market. Well, that's it for this one. I picked up the RX 580, so time to let me have it in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, why not smash the like button? And if you appreciate our content and can afford to make a small donation each month, then please check out our Patreon account. Link is in the video description. On that note, a big thank you to our patrons, especially those who helped refine the selection of games we used in this video. Finally, hit subscribe if you haven't already. This will ensure you don't risk missing any big benchmark videos. I'm your host, Steve. See you again soon.